Good afternoon and welcome to ThinkTech Asia. It's Tuesday, January 27, 2015, and I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. A little later on today's program, we'll be welcoming our guest, Micah Fisher, a PhD student in the Department of Geography at the University of Hawaii and an expert on Indonesian social and economic development issues. Micah and I will be discussing Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, which is also the largest city in Southeast Asia and one of the largest conurbations in the world. We're specifically going to be discussing one of Jakarta's major challenges, flooding. Over the past decades, the city has been increasingly stricken by a series of devastating inundation events. We will be discussing the complex knot of factors that contribute to flooding, how climate change and socioeconomic trends could exacerbate the problem, and why it's so hard to make it go away. But before we begin our discussion, we'll have a short news summary of ongoing issues in Asia. If you have any Asia-related events to publish here at ThinkTech, please contact me at keiththinktech@gmail.com. You can also send me questions and comments directly via Twitter at KCCGeography. So this week in Southeast Asia, news continues to stream in from the Philippines concerning a clash between police commandos and Muslim guerrillas in Maguindanao province on Monday. At least 43 police commandos have been killed in what's been called the biggest combat loss for the government in recent memory. The fighting broke out when a police commando unit came under fire from hardline Muslim insurgents in the village of Tucana Lipao. Rebels say that the clash resulted because the police broke the terms of a ceasefire agreement that requires them to notify the guerrillas of any operations in guerrilla-held territory. Maraxis, the country's Secretary of the Interior, explained that the operation intended to capture or kill Zulkifli bin Hir, or Marwan for short, who is suspected of masterminding terrorist bombings in the Philippines. Government reports claim that Marwan was indeed killed in the assault. Another wanted terror suspect, Abdul Basit Usman, escaped. The clash was against fighters from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and was evidently due to a failure in communication. Last March, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, a rebel group, signed a peace agreement with the government. The agreement aims to establish a more powerful and better funded autonomous region for minority Muslims in the southern part of the archipelago and end a conflict that has lasted decades and claimed an estimated 150,000 lives. Monday's police operation was not against the Moro front, but rather against a smaller breakaway group called the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. Also in Southeast Asia, Thailand's military-appointed National Legislative Assembly voted overwhelmingly to impeach former Thai Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra for her role in a rice subsidy program that cost billions of baht. Yingluck was removed from office last year just before the military seized power in a coup. The controversial rice program began in 2011 and promised to pay farmers generous subsidies for rice, ostensibly to support the agricultural sector. However, critics argue that the program constituted a reckless expenditure of public funds for the purpose of wooing rural voters. Previously, Yingluck was placed under investigation by Thailand's National Anti-Corruption Commission. If she's found guilty of the current charges, she could go to prison for up to 10 years. In a statement, Yingluck vowed to fight the charges and firmly asserted that the rice program was beneficial for the farmers and for Thailand. In South Asia, President Obama is visiting South Asia and will became the first U.S. president to attend India's Republic Day parade. While seeing a parade might not seem like a big deal in terms of international affairs, analysts say that India generally uses the choice of an honored guest at the parade to subtly signal international policy directions, and that the invitation of the U.S. president for the first time signals a thawing in relations between the world's two largest democracies. The closer bond between Obama and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has improved significantly compared with a year ago, when the two countries were at odds over an Indian diplomat's alleged abuse of her housekeeper. President Obama will use his time in India to discuss some important issues, including the U.S. desire to increase commercial ties with India. The U.S. would also like to encourage India to move towards more renewable energy sources and potentially to agree on a cap on greenhouse gas emissions. However, India feels that capping emissions would stifle the country's rapidly growing economy and hinder economic and social development. Now, on to our interview. Today's topic focuses on the capital of Indonesia and the largest city in Southeast Asia. The Jakarta metropolitan area is one of the largest conurbations on the planet and is still growing. The city is unquestionably a major driver of Indonesia's economy, accounting for approximately a quarter of the country's gross domestic product. It's also what geographers refer to as a primate city, and this means that the city far and away outclasses Indonesia's second largest city, Surabaya, in terms of size and economic output. Jakarta carries Indonesia's global ambitions on its shoulders, and it's the country's window to the world. It is a center of high finance, investment, and economic development and growth, but the city also faces challenges. One of the most intractable problems is flooding. Given its geography in the tropical monsoon belt, the city perpetually faces the threat of flooding. And in recent years, increasing areas of the city have been inundated by floods. Joining me today to discuss the flooding issue in Jakarta is Micah Fisher, a PhD student in geography at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Micah is currently studying socioeconomic and political cultural issues in Indonesia and has tremendous depth of experience in that country, having worked for C4, the World Bank, the government of Indonesia, and the city of Jakarta. Micah, welcome to our program. First of all, I'd like to start off by asking you to tell us a little bit about your connection to Indonesia and why the country is special for you.
Well, thanks, Keith. Thanks for having me today. I really enjoy your program. The last two shows were really excellent.
Thank you.
Enjoyed learning about Indonesia, about Jokowi and all the political changes, the exciting transformations going on there, about disaster in the Philippines and Haiyan, and I really love that you engage people on current events issues in Southeast Asia and throughout Asia.
Thank you for saying that.
So in terms of my background, I was born in Indonesia. I grew up in Bali in a small village named Mas. My parents were working on agricultural issues, rural development issues. I grew up there until I was 10. I went to local elementary school, and I used to go on these trips to eastern Indonesia to remote areas and hang out with farmers. And then things changed a little bit. I moved to upstate New York and grew up there through middle school and high school and college,
Wow.
at which point I returned back to Indonesia to work.
Mm-hmm.
I initially went back after the Indian Ocean tsunami that hit Banda Aceh most dramatically. 190,000 people were lost. So really interesting to hear John Matsuoka's perspective on Haiyan in your last segment. But I moved to Aceh and worked on some of the challenges of reconstruction and rehabilitation. It was a tremendous experience. And then I moved to Jakarta and worked on major infrastructure projects. And flooding was certainly the biggest issue at that time. When I moved to Jakarta that month, it was hit with a major disaster.
What year was that?
This was 2007 when I moved to work there, and I ended up working on flooding issues for the next 4 or 5 years.
And so the 2007 flood, just to kind of put it in context, up until that time, if I'm not mistaken, that was the largest flood that Jakarta had ever experienced, right?
Yeah, Jakarta gets hit with a major flood event about every 5 years. So there was an event in 2002, there was an event in 1996. In 2007, it was a major event. It brought the city to a standstill for about a month, getting schools back into operation. There was casualties, there was major issues that were experienced at that time.
Okay, now we've got a picture up here. Zuri just showed us our picture. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is a photo that you sent that illustrates the tremendous growth of Jakarta over the past several decades, since 1949, since the country became independent. I think that maybe you and I are a little bit more familiar than with Jakarta than some of our viewers. So could you tell us a little bit about the city? And your experiences with it. Why is Jakarta so important to Indonesia, and what has been its growth trajectory over the past 5 decades or so?
That's a big question. So I'll back up a little bit. I mean, Indonesia is the 4th largest country by population. There's over 250 million people that live there. This is, a significant country. There's over 13,000 islands in Indonesia with many different diverse cultural groups and languages. Indonesia, the concept of Indonesia came into being really in 1949 when kind of national identity was pushed forward by...
and that's when the country achieved independence from the Dutch.
Independence from the Dutch. So Sukarno came and built city as Jakarta as the city, the kind of identity, the center of Indonesia. And so he built these big roads and major public infrastructure that showed how this was the convening point of Indonesia.
Right.
And so lots of people would come in and move to the city, and it continues to be kind of the center focus of Indonesia. Major population.
Sukarno's, pardon me for interrupting you, Sukarno, who is one of Indonesia's founders and a national hero still today, I generally refer to him kind of as George Washington of Indonesia almost, but that's a little American-centric, right? But it's hard to underestimate the importance of Sukarno to the Indonesian identity and what he did. But he was trained as a civil engineer and an architect, if I'm not mistaken. And he was heavily influenced by the French city planner, Le Corbusier. And that's reflected in the way that Jakarta, which has been around, Jakarta's been a city, or it's been a settlement for more than 1,500 years. But it's undergone its most radical transformation since 1949. And Sukarno's inspiration from Le Corbusier, that served as kind of the blueprint for that, right?
Right, and so Jakarta has gone through major phases, and it began as a place that was a port city, very important to the Dutch, very important to the spice trade, influencing trade all over the world.
Right.
And Sukarno kind of unified the country, and then in 1965, there was a coup, and Suharto became this father of development. He really liberalized investment, and this became one of the biggest cities in the world. I mean,
Right,
Jakarta's
it became a magnet for investment capital, right? So it's a city of opportunity, that goes without saying, for Indonesia. We've referred to it earlier as a primate city, which means that, unlike the United States, when you think about the U.S. as nodes for activity, we've got Los Angeles, and Chicago, and Houston, and New York City, obviously. In Indonesia, though there are other large cities, Jakarta is unquestionably the biggest, but it has a lot of major issues, just like many megacities in Southeast Asia and beyond. And the biggest one is flooding, right? And we've alluded to that already. That's the main point of today's program. Can you tell us a little bit about why flooding is such an issue in Jakarta? What causes it? What exacerbates it? How is it felt on the ground in Jakarta? And what does it do to the city? And what did it do to Indonesia?
Okay, so to get a sense of scale, the city of Jakarta is about 10 million people. That's packed into an administrative area that is similar to the size of Oahu.
Wow.
But in terms of the broader population of the Jakarta metropolitan area, there's about 25 million people throughout that region. And it's a really interesting area because in the upstream areas, there are 2 major volcanoes. You can see them in the distance in the mornings. And when there's heavy rainfall, there's a lot of flows that come into the city. There's 13 rivers that channel it. And
So it's like a delta.
it's like a delta alluvial
it's a
plain.
Yeah, alluvial plain.
And then the city is it's a coastal city, and about 40% of it is below sea level. So
Wow.
you have these many different influences on the city.
So we're showing a map here. Can you explain to us what this is a
So
map
that's
of Jakarta?
that's the administrative unit of Jakarta.
Mm-hmm.
It's and this map is actually showing land subsidence. So not only is it 40% below sea level, it's also showing that the ground is actually subsiding. And so that
Sinking. So the city's
so that
sinking.
the area in the north part of Jakarta there, in that image, you can see that one of those locations subsided about 26 centimeters.
So on this map, blue indicates more subsidence?
Right, and this is just in one given year.
Wow.
So subsidence is a major issue.
Can you tell us
solid waste management is a major issue.
What causes the sinking?
The
That may
sinking-
seem alien to a lot of people that a city is actually, it's sinking, right?
And-
Like
and it-
Atlantis almost.
And
yeah?
it's quite common in some of the more major cities that when you extract a large volume from the lower aquifers of water for public services, you have this subsidence effect that happens, and it's more dramatic in some cases than others.
So the city is essentially overtapping its aquifer. They're taking out too much groundwater.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were talking about. This is a big city that has formal and informal sectors. It needs to supply basic things like water to communities and to different, housing developments. And then, as you mentioned, the flooding issue is a major problem. So you have these upstream events where you have heavy rainfalls, about sometimes 4,000 millimeters in a year. It comes down, and then you have these localized rainfall events, as well as the potential for coastal flooding. And when all of these happen at the same time, you have a really significant event that can inundate a lot of areas.
I see. So you mentioned a moment ago, this is an important concept that I'd like to elaborate on a little bit. You mentioned the formal and the informal sector, and some of our viewers might not be as familiar with this concept, but the easiest way that I generally describe that as a formal sector is a job that you get that you pay Social Security on, yeah? Whereas an informal sector job is one in which you get paid under the table. And we've all done informal work, especially as scholars, as starving students. But normally, most occupations here are formal, yeah, in the formal sector. In a lot of developing countries, it's just the reverse, especially in a situation like Jakarta, where you have so much rural to urban migration that the formal sector of the economy just is not able to absorb all the migrants. And so a lot of people find work in the informal sector in many places, and I think Jakarta is an example. It's more than 50% of the workforce is in the informal sector. So and informal sector jobs include food vending and tire repairmen and things like that. Yeah.
So I've talked a little bit about numbers and kind of the challenges overall, but just to give you a sense of what the city looks like, you have skyscrapers just like any major metropolitan area in the world. You have really lavish malls. There's probably more malls in Jakarta than any other city. Yeah. And so I like to describe Jakarta as like the 5-star or the no star. Even though there's a big middle class there, it's really apparent this kampung, which is sometimes translated as slum area, and these very, very lavish development areas, which makes for an interesting contrast. So, you could be going through this, mall with international, the most expensive things you can buy, and then you could be walking through this area without much public services in the informal sector that you mentioned. And the kampungs are really interesting places. Beijing, that people talk about hutongs and things like that.
Right.
When you walk through a kampung, you get this really vibrant sense of a community. In a lot of areas in Jakarta, it's been surrounded by development that has expanded in these areas.
So let me interrupt you for a minute. We'll talk more about the kampungs because it's an important point in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a break. Thank you for joining us here on ThinkTech Asia.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right, and what's good, and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Okay, welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Keith Bettinger. Thank you for joining us here. Today, my guest is Micah Fisher, a PhD student from the University of Hawaii, but an expert on Indonesian politics and society. And what we're talking about today is the problem of flooding in Jakarta. Jakarta is one of the largest cities in the world, and they have a massive flooding problem. So before we went to break, we started talking about kampungs. And Micah, you mentioned that kampungs are, the term kampung is generally translated as village, and sometimes it has a connotation of a slum area. Now, Jakarta has been referred to, it's been called a city of kampungs, a city of villages. So can you tell us a little bit about what that means and why this translation of slum really doesn't do justice to the term kampung? And especially maybe tell us a little bit about the social capital element of kampungs.
Well, it would be really difficult to talk about the entire city because it is a big city. You have the Jakarta area, and then you have some of the more industrial areas in the west, and you have these satellite cities as part of the program development. But if you go into any typical kampung, and we're going to talk about flooding today, especially one kampung in particular that deals with some of the most dramatic flood events, you go in there and they've come up with really creative ways to provide public services. So you have these hand carts coming through that sells the vegetables. You have satay vendors that come in to sell different things. You even have people that come in, selling all sorts of different things. So there's this vibrancy and this interconnectedness and there's a real sense of community throughout the kampungs.
But what are some of the manifestations of that sense of community, would you say? How is that visible, tangible?
Well, you just get a real sense that everybody knows their neighbor. There's things always happening. There's not much public space because of the rapid growth and because it is such a big city and highly dense population. So there's these really creative ways that people have come to use space. So, for example, there is one of the most interesting phenomenon that has happened anywhere I've seen is that in Jakarta, they now are able to close down one of the streets to go ride their bicycles. So
Wow.
This is kind of like taking back public spaces, and people just come out and ride bicycles in an area that's often thought of as the heaviest traffic anywhere. But in terms of some of these communities that I've spent time in, I was really interested because I was working on major infrastructure issues, how to think about dredging these waterways. A lot has talked about how do you create channel and engineering designs of these things, but I really wanted to see what was happening along these riverbank communities and how some of these communities were shaped and how they dealt with this major hazard of flood events. And you really learn that there's a lot of creative ways that people have become accustomed to this. And it's pretty dramatic. I mean, in 2007, the event that I was talking about earlier, Kampung Melayu, it flooded up to 25 feet
Wow.
in some areas. So
2.5 stories.
Yeah, 2.5 stories. So, you go through this area, and I think there was a picture flashed up earlier that there's these kind of small alleyways, and pretty much all the first floors are empty. So people have gotten accustomed to, in this one community in particular, once a month there's a major flood event. So they'll move up to the second floor when things happen. Sometimes they have to evacuate. How those mechanisms work are really, really unique and interesting kind of social processes that have occurred, which, 30 years ago, these communities that were there from the beginning, it was just a normal kampung, didn't deal with that type of flooding.
Right.
And all of a sudden, now they are.
So that's really interesting. Let's go back to Kampung Melayu, and it's well known amongst Indonesianists that that's kind of one of the epicenters for flooding. It's one of the most vulnerable areas. Now, one of the topics that we've covered on ThinkTech Asia, it's particularly interesting to me, is this notion of differential vulnerability. So the idea that impacts from disasters or hazards or other negative events, they're not spread evenly. Instead, they fall disproportionately on the shoulders of some groups and not others. And so Kampung Melayu, if I'm not mistaken, is particularly vulnerable because it's a floodplain. Now, we've talked about Jakarta being an alluvial plain. There's 13 rivers going through the alluvial plain. And Kampung Melayu is built in the floodplain. And rivers and flat areas, they just naturally move from side to side, right? That's the way that rivers evolve. They change, right? They're dynamic systems. So how is it that the people in Kampung Melayu and other places in Jakarta that are settled in floodplains or along rail corridors, how is it that they come to be in these places? What are the forces that are pushing them there?
Well, like I just mentioned, some people, some of the communities that I've come to know well there, some of the families were there from the beginning. They were born there from.
So Kampung Melayu is an old settlement.
There's many different factors. So some were born there. Some, in Jakarta, often people talk about this figure that in 1 year you have 250,000, so 250,000 people trying to move to Jakarta, looking for opportunity. Some make it, some have to go back to the villages.
Wow, so let's say that again, 250,000 people a year are coming into Jakarta.
Are coming in and trying to find work, trying to find opportunity. So some come into the areas of Kampung Melayu. It all depends on some of the networks that they've established. So sometimes they're ethnically divided. Yes.
Kampung Melayu and other kampungs, such as neighborhoods like that, absorb some of these 250,000 people that are coming into the city. I see. So that's kind of a stepping stone for people?
Yeah, I mean, people are looking for opportunity. And Jakarta, we talked about the historical reasons why Jakarta is the symbol of the nation, of this big nation with huge populations. This is where the political center, the economic opportunities are available. So in a place like Kampung Melayu, you have this interesting historical place relationship for some people and other people who are coming in looking for opportunities.
Right.
And the way that they've learned how to respond to this increasingly dramatic flood event that they have to deal with is quite an amazing thing. So the natural next question would be, what is the responsibility of government? What is, where is the risk reached such a level that it's time to go find a new place? And what are your opportunities? Because for some people, this is what they've always known.
And those are questions that the city government is currently, and the national government, in fact, are grappling with. We talk a lot about Indonesia. In the 3 programs I've done, we've focused on Indonesia and the Philippines. But and this is an important problem, but it's also important beyond Indonesia, this problem of flooding in Jakarta. So can you talk a little bit about why flooding in Jakarta? What does it mean beyond Indonesia for Southeast Asia and for the world in general? Why is this a problem that people outside of Indonesia should pay attention to?
Yeah, I think that's a really complex question. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of it depends on the specific situation. But I think that, even if it sounds like such a foreign case or a different situation in Kampung Melayu and Jakarta, we deal with those issues here in Hawaii or major metropolitan areas throughout Asia, throughout Southeast Asia, are dealing with issues of subsidence, waste management. How do we give water to our communities? How do we deal with situations where floods could impact them? What do coastal cities have in common? And I think there's really a lot to learn about the adaptive processes that people have learned to develop in these certain situations. So in Jakarta, for example,
before you go, we've got a picture here. Can you tell us a little bit about this picture?
So that's Kampung Melayu, and you can see kind of the different stories of the houses there. This is right along the river. You can see that solid waste management, trash is a big issue. You can also see that, what people often ask, what's in the water, and sanitation, sewerage is kind of a problem that's often unseen, but only less than 2% of the city is connected to piped sewerage.
Wow. So that's the root of the aquifer problem.
Right, and here's another dramatic image of the flood at Manggarai. This is the reason that the waters now have backed up so much into this kampung.
What is the structure that we're seeing here?
This is the floodgates that split kind of the design that the Dutch initially developed for Jakarta that it protects this low-lying area, and sends water either to the west or to the east of Jakarta. They call it the East Flood Canal.
Part of the flood infrastructure.
Right, part of the flood. So there's the East Flood Canal and there's the West Flood Canal. So that image was, the governor wanted to show one of the biggest problems is solid waste management. And so there's this dichotomous problem where you know, the government's saying, hey, if you don't throw your trash in the river, then we won't have flooding. Whereas the communities like Kampung Melayu are saying, we don't have anywhere else to put our trash because the government services or the services to address these kind of things that we expect on a day-to-day basis, you know, they're not necessarily available. What do you want me to throw my trash right on my front doorstep?
Sure.
It's the easiest way to kind of relieve waste.
Yeah, it's a huge dilemma, isn't it? So the last question I think that we have before we go into our cultural corner is, I talk a lot about climate change. It's an issue that's important to me and I think to a lot of our viewers. In Jakarta, Jakarta is a coastal city, and we've talked about the problem of subsidence. It's a sinking city. And in Southeast Asia, and right on the equator, and so we know that climate change is an issue, but what threat does climate change pose to Jakarta, and how could it exacerbate the flooding problem?
Well, as we know, you know, we hear more and more that climate change is going to make these challenges more difficult to deal with. It's a low-lying city. If the city is already subsiding and you have sea level rise, for example, what are the type of solutions that you have?
So what are they doing about it?
Well, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues that are associated with climate change, not just sea level rise, but the changing patterns. This impacts anybody from farmers and how they understand when their growing seasons are, how bad the floods from the upstream hazards will be. And so what to do about it is a really interesting one. And the things that, you know, we were just talking about, what is the government or what are communities, how are they going to face this added challenge of climate change? And, you know, some of the projects that are being discussed, you know, sometimes you think, who are these projects being developed for? So now they're talking about a major seawall to protect. So, okay, if the city's sinking and the sea level is rising, why don't we build a seawall that protects the city? And
how big is the seawall? 32 kilometers, I think.
Yes, 32 kilometers. So, and they're planning on building a road on top of it, so providing traffic to address the traffic congestion.
So it's a massive infrastructure project.
Massive infrastructure. But now what we're seeing is that other different sectors are looking at this as a real opportunity. So in terms of, okay, here we have our public investment, but also a lot of investors have come in and said, how do we develop additional real estate?
Sure.
Which, you know, the government then has to provide supportive services for those things. So in terms of how we address with climate change, and not just for Jakarta, but how do we think through the type of challenges that we're facing collectively, and for who are these different solutions being crafted for, is a really central question in climate change, you know, vulnerability assessment, disaster risk reduction programs, climate change adaptation, how you craft your solutions going forward.
Okay, so I think this is a picture of Kampung Melayu, and these are the alleys that you were talking about earlier. This is basically a street in the kampung. It's not very accessible to traffic. This is how people get around.
Right, and you can see the density there. That's my friend Ade, and he took us around the community there. I've known him for years, and he's a really amazing guy. He's found many different ways to involve local kids in different programs.
Wow. And that's part of the social capital.
It's social capital, totally. You know, they have music nights during the kind of equivalent of the 4th of July. There, they have these big parades and things like that. So.
Okay, well, thanks, Micah. You know, we've talked a lot about the problem.
Sorry, I could go on and on.
I know you could. And we've talked about the problem. We haven't gotten to the solution yet.
Right.
So what that means is we're going to have you back on the program to talk more about this. But we're running out of time. I want to thank you for being here at ThinkTech with us. That was really fascinating. I'm sure the viewers really enjoyed that. But now it's time for our cultural corner segment, and we have a special tribute
thanks
today.
for having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Micah. We're now coming to the end of our program, and so it's time for this week's Culture Corner, where we showcase a little slice of Asian culture every week. This week we're going to pay a special tribute to a brilliant artist and a cultural ambassador that sadly passed away just a couple of days ago. Professor Harja Susilo, or Pak Sus to those that knew him. Pak Sus taught Javanese gamelan at the University of Hawaii for more than 40 years, and he was recognized as the first Javanese gamelan teacher in the United States. He earned his BA and MA in ethnomusicology at UCLA and popularized traditional Javanese culture and music in Hawaii and elsewhere. He won the Indonesian Presidential Art Award, the Hadiah Seni, in 1993. Pak Sus was born in 1934 in Yogyakarta on Java in Indonesia. And Pak Sus will be remembered for his patience and selflessness by the hundreds of students he taught and mentored over the years. He enriched our community by fostering an appreciation for cultural diversity and the unique art form that is Javanese gamelan. Our Cultural Corner clip today shows Pak Sus doing what he loved. And with that, we'll end our program for this week. We'll be back again next week at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, so make sure to join us then. Aloha.
The study of music of other cultures can help open the doors not only to other musical systems, but also to different aspects of those cultures. For a musician, gamelan music can be appreciated not only for its rich tone quality, but also for the subtle relationships between its more than 20 different musical parts. Java is one of more than 3,000 islands that make up the Republic of Indonesia. Within Indonesia, there are several different music traditions. The gamelan music of Central Java is based mainly on styles that originated in the cities of Yogyakarta and Surakarta, also known as Jogja and Solo. The history of music and dance in Central Java extends back to ancient times. Regional courts in Jogja and Solo fostered the development of many performing arts, including music. Under royal patronage, these performing traditions were brought to the high level of refinement and sophistication that is evident in gamelan music and other Javanese arts today. After the formation of the Republic of Indonesia in 1945, the royal courts of Central Java continued to nurture the arts. Major support, however, is now provided by the Indonesian government. Since gamelan music was introduced to the West at the Paris exhibition of 1889, its attraction has grown internationally. Today, many gamelan are housed at museums, universities, and other institutions throughout the world, making practical involvement with the music possible for the non-Javanese. For students such as these at the University of Hawaii, the study of gamelan music can serve as an introduction to the understanding of Javanese culture. Because the basic principles of the music are quite clear, a beginning student may become involved immediately in playing many of the instruments in the gamelan. For the more advanced student, the subtleties and intricacies of the music at a more detailed level can offer years of challenging study. A complete gamelan consists of 2 sets of instruments made of bronze, brass, or iron and tuned to different scales. Since there is no standard tuning, the exact tuning of these scales may vary from one gamelan to another, thus giving each gamelan its own unique sound.